Thank you for joining us for a virtual walkthrough of the exhibit, The Kaleidoscope of Textiles, Dress as Multidimensional Cultural Documents. This exhibit is presented by the Department of Textiles, Fashion Merchandising, and Design at the College of Business here at URI. This exhibit is curated by Dr. Jessica Struble, a professor in our department who specializes in the social psychology of dress and appearance, and the 7 graduate and undergraduate students of her ethnic dress and textiles class this past semester. Each of us selected 1 to 2 garments from URI's historic textile and costume collection that was under-researched or under-documented. Through our work, we discovered a richness in both design and meanings, patterns of indigenous resistance to assimilation, and the affirmation of ethnic and national identities through dress. The items we will see today represent the ethnic diversity and socio-cultural richness of our community and promote respect and understanding of diverse ethnic identities in the United States. I'd like to start off with this delightful little hat called a bowlen hoot. Its most distinctive feature are these 14 red pom-poms on the top of the hat that actually form the shape of a cross. So young women in the Black Forest in Germany would receive this hat for their confirmation. The red color signified that they were ready for marriage. And then when they did get married, they got a black version. This bowlen hoot is a way to signify both their gender identity as a woman as well as their marital status. Another example of this kind of expression of the female gender identity in our exhibit is the burqa. The burqa has received a lot of negative associations with Islamic fundamentalist groups because of mandatory laws that required women to wear it all the time. But at its core, it's an expression of femininity. You know, a lot of women still choose to wear the burqa both as an expression of their religion or their religious piety, as well as modesty. And ironically, some of them say that it's really freeing. You know, it's being able to hide in plain sight, not having to worry about what you put on every day underneath the burqa. It's a very interesting and different expression of female identity. One more example is the Romanian blouse. So this was also an item worn exclusively by women, and it has some really interesting embroidery on it. And each of these sections has different names. So on the shoulders, we have the sky, and then underneath them is the undersky or the earth. And then trailing down onto the chest and onto the shoulders, we have the rivers, which feed into the sea or the border of the blouse. So you might find this blouse really familiar because it looks a lot like the peasant blouse, and in a lot of ways it kind of is. The Romanian blouse has really struggled with cultural appropriation. In 1981, Yves Saint Laurent launched the La Blouse Romaine collection that really popularized this look. And I think it's important for our TMD design students to understand this story. As aspiring designers, they need to understand how to appropriately appreciate and be inspired by cultural designs while also properly crediting and respecting the cultures that they come from. And another object in our exhibit that has had similar issues with cultural appropriation is this beautiful ikat robe. It's really easy to see why designers were so inspired by this beautiful fabric that's created with very specific dyeing and weaving techniques. But it's also found its way onto handbags and patterns for clothing and all that kind of stuff without the proper credit to the Uzbekistani people. This ikat robe was worn by men as a symbol of status and wealth. If you look really closely at the lining, you'll see images of butterflies, which were a symbol of protection from evil spirits. So moving across to another Central Asian country, they also have this tradition of giving robes as a sign of honor. And this robe comes from the Teki tribe of either Turkmenistan or Afghanistan. And instead of a robe for men, it was worn by women. What's really interesting about this one is that if you look at the sleeves, they look very thin and almost kind of, you can't really stick your arms into them. And the point is that they are vestigial. So we have 2 examples of this one, in part so that you can see these differences. First, you know, to see its kind of design beautifully laid out, and then secondly, to see how it was worn over the head with these vestigial sleeves kind of just hanging in the back. But it's also interesting because when this student began her research, the first robe she looked at was made of rayon. And rayon is kind of a newer fiber, you know, hasn't been around forever. And the research she was doing was saying that most of these robes were made with silk. So she did some digging and looked around in the collection and found another one of these robes that was made in silk. And I think these 2 robes tell a great story of continuity of tradition, utilizing new materials as they come into availability. We have a similar story here with the two seminal skirts. These are two seminal patchwork skirts of the 20th century, where originally they were mostly made of cotton. And then we have this beautiful, more modern example that uses this shiny purple rayon, as well as machine-made lace and lame up in the matching cape. So these two outfits were created for the Green Corn Dance, which is the New Year's celebration that takes place in the early summer months. But in addition to continuity of materials, I think these two skirts also show us a story of the continuity despite oppressive, dominant forces. I think we're all aware that Indigenous people in America have been moved multiple times. The Seminole people were first moved due to violence and pressures from European colonists down into the upper region of Florida, and then moved again as part of the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. The fact that these traditions continue shows the strength of their ethnic identity and their community, even despite all these hardships. The mola is a garment of the Guna people who live in Panama. So in the 20th century, missionaries and the Panamanian government wanted to take away a lot of these traditional cultural symbols so that their people would assimilate into the dominant culture. But they fought back and rebelled to really preserve these symbols of their ethnic identity. The mola is interesting because it refers not only to the blouse as a whole, but also to each of these two panels. The two panels, front and back, are very similar, but not quite identical. They use a technique called reverse applique, in which 2 to 7 layers of fabric are stitched together and then cut away slowly to reveal each layer below. And this really creates this beautiful depth of pattern. And then positive applique can be added to the top, as well as additional embroidery to really fill up the entire space. And the last objects that we have in this exhibit are these Peruvian textile fragments. These are the oldest ones in the exhibit, from around 1000 to 1470 CE, or about the 11th to 15th centuries. In the 20th century, ethnic textiles were increasingly looted due to this fear that indigenous arts were going to die out. And sadly, some of these fragments show evidence of having been cut to increase their saleability. But all the garments you've seen today are just a small part of our exhibit, and the exhibit is just a small, tiny fraction of the fantastic historic textiles and costume collection here at URI. The collection specializes in Rhode Island history and the clothing of the everyday person. Highlights include an excellent collection of children's clothing, Rhode Island designers, and much, much more. Stop by Quinn Hall soon to see the exhibit.